He kept no clocks in his bedchamber, which was, the household agreed, the single vainest economy a man who valued punctuality above breath could possibly practice, since it meant that every morning of his life he woke by instinct alone, in the dark, in a room whose curtains had not been opened by another human hand in 3 years. Julian Thorne, 9th Duke of Ashcombe, had not smiled, not once, not by any servant's honest memory, not even at Christmas, not even at his own sister's wedding 2 winters past, in 1,091 days. Someone had counted. It had, admittedly, been the housekeeper before this one, in a ledger she was not paid to keep, out of something closer to grief than curiosity. Ashcombe Hall itself seemed to keep the same accounting, the curtains drawn in room after room, the pianoforte under its dust sheet, a rose garden gone to bramble behind a gate nobody had oiled since a woman named Eleanor stopped needing it opened. Into this arrangement, on the 2nd Tuesday of October, walked a young woman with mud on the hem of her only good dress and an opinion about curtains that no one had thought to ask for. Her name was Cassia Whitlow, and she laughed at things, genuinely, unglamorously, at her own expense as often as at the world's, in a manner the Duke of Ashcombe would come, by spring, to find entirely unbearable to live without. But first, the curtains had to be opened. All of them. In a very particular order, starting with his. Nothing about the winter that followed went according to anyone's schedule, least of all the Duke's, who had built his entire remaining life around never again being late for anything that mattered. It is worth saying now, before the story properly begins, that he was about to be told he was late for something every single morning, by a woman standing in a shaft of sudden and entirely uninvited daylight, and that he would spend a great many months insisting he minded. He did not mind. He would take rather a long time admitting it. But that was later. First, the hiring letter, the coach ride, the mud, and a household that had not seen its master's window opened before 9 o'clock in 3 years, arranged now around the single unbending law that no one was to wake the Duke of Ashcombe. Cassia had not read that law. Nobody had thought to write it down for her, on account of her having arrived 4 hours earlier than expected. In weather nobody had planned for, to a post nobody had properly explained. The letter that brought her to Ashcombe had been terse to the point of insult, which she would later learn was simply how the house wrote to everyone, including, on occasion itself, the position of housekeeper as vacant. Character references required. Wages adequate. Coach fare will be reimbursed upon arrival, not before. She had read it 3 times in the vicarage kitchen, where she'd been keeping accounts for 11 months and boiling with the particular restlessness of a woman doing work beneath her competence for wages beneath her patience, and she had laughed, once, sharply, the involuntary kind, at the phrase wages adequate, because nothing in her life so far had been merely adequate. It had all been either catastrophic or, more often, absurd, and she had long ago decided which of the two was more survivable. She had buried her father the previous winter, a bookbinder, meticulous and gentle, who had taught her double entry accounting the way other fathers taught their daughters embroidery, and who had left her a younger brother to feed, and no land, no annuity, and a startling quantity of unfinished ledgers that turned out, on close reading, to explain rather a lot about the family's poverty. She had wept for exactly 1 week, by her own private count, and had then decided out loud to an empty kitchen, which was either eccentric or entirely sane, depending on one's temperament, that the world could sit her in the mud as often as it liked. But it would have to teach her not to laugh, and she doubted it had the patience. The coach to Ashcombe arrived at a crossing 2 miles short of the gate, on account of a bridge deemed unsafe, and Cassia Whitlow walked the remaining distance in October rain, with her one trunk on a borrowed cart, and her second-best boots ruined by the 2nd mile. She arrived at Ashcombe Hall not through the front door, which no one had told her to use, but through a side gate that deposited her directly into a garden of dead roses and a fountain she did not see until she was standing in it. It was not a large fountain. This did not make it more dignified. She came up out of it laughing, streaming, her boots full of what she would later insist, defensively, was merely fountain water and not, as one under-gardener suggested with an entirely straight face, evidence that the fountain had feelings about new arrivals. A very large ginger cat sat on the rim throughout, watching her with the settled, unhurried judgment of a creature who had seen weather before and expected better from a grown woman. "You might have warned me," she told the cat, wringing out her sleeve. The cat did not warn her about anything else that day, which in retrospect she considered a serious lapse in its duties, since the second surprise of the afternoon was rather larger than a fountain. She found the housekeeper's room empty. The previous woman had left in a hurry a fortnight prior, over some disagreement with the steward that no one would fully explain, and a note pinned to the door in Pemberton the butler's hand, informing whoever arrived that the household ran on a schedule not to be deviated from, that breakfast was at 7 precisely, and that his Grace was on no account to be disturbed before he rang. Cassia, dripping, read this twice, and formed the entirely reasonable opinion that a house run this rigidly by a staff this thin was a house in trouble, and that trouble, being her one area of genuine professional expertise, was exactly why she'd been hired. She did not yet know that the ringing bell in question had not, in point of fact, rung on schedule in 11 days, because the Duke of Ashcombe had lately taken to lying awake in the dark, counting the cracks in a ceiling he refused to have plastered, and that this particular morning, the one on which Cassia Whitlow, still faintly damp, would walk the length of the east wing inventorying linens with the brisk competence of a woman who intended to have opinions about everything by Friday. He had a magistrate arriving at 9 to discuss a boundary dispute that would determine whether 4 tenant families kept their grazing rights through the winter, and that he had for the first time in 1,091 days overslept. No one in the house was going to wake him. That was the rule, and rules, in a house that had stopped almost everything else, were the one thing still faithfully observed. Cassia did not know the rule. This was either the worst luck Ashcombe Hall had seen in 3 years, or, as the cat appeared to privately conclude, watching her march up the east stairs with an inventory ledger under one arm, and her hair still dripping onto the runner, the best. She found his door by process of elimination, the only one on the corridor with curtains she could see, through the gap beneath it, was still drawn against a sun already well up, and she knocked twice, got nothing, and did what 11 months of running a vicarage household had taught her to do with any silence that had a 9 o'clock appointment behind it. She went in. The room was dark in the specific, arranged way of a room kept dark on purpose, and it took her eyes a moment to find the shape of the bed, and the larger, stiller shape of the man in it, entirely and expensively asleep. "Good morning," she said to the room in general, and crossed to the window, and drew the curtains apart with both hands in one decisive motion, the way she'd have done it for a bedridden aunt, or a stubborn goat, or anyone else whose objections she had already decided not to entertain. Light came into that room for the first time in 3 years, the way water comes through a broken dam, all at once, and with no apparent memory of ever having been asked to stay out. The Duke of Ashcombe woke to it the way a man wakes to an insult, fully, furiously, and with his hand already reaching for a robe that was not where he had left it, because nothing in the room was where he had left it, because a stranger had rearranged the light itself before introducing herself. "Who," he said, in a voice sanded down by sleep and outrage in roughly equal parts, "are you?" "The new housekeeper," said Cassia, tying back the second curtain with the sash exactly as if she had done it every morning of her life, which 3 hours into her employment she very nearly had. "And you, your Grace, are extremely late." He looked, she would think later, like a man who had not in some years been told anything he had not already decided to believe. He looked at the window. He looked at her. He looked, briefly, betrayed by the sun itself, which was doing nothing to help him. "There is a rule," he said, with the particular patience of a man reciting something he had not expected to need to recite, in this house. "There's a magistrate," said Cassia, "in your drive. I passed his carriage coming up. He's early, which I gather is worse in your case than being late." She set the ledger down on the nearest chair, unhurried, and looked at him, directly, without the small courteous downward tilt of the eyes that every other servant in the house had apparently been trained into by 3 years of practice, and which he realized with some private alarm, entirely stopped noticing was missing until this moment, when it was. "You do not," he said slowly, sitting up, "know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," she said. "You're the man who's about to keep 4 families waiting on their grazing rights because nobody in this house had the nerve to open a curtain." She was already at the door. "Breakfast is laid, or was, 20 minutes ago. I'd hurry." "Your Grace," the title arrived a half-second late, appended almost as an afterthought, and he could not tell. This would trouble him, mildly, for days, whether it had been respect or its opposite. She was gone before he could decide whether he was owed an apology or she was. The cat, who had followed her up the stairs at a dignified distance and installed himself on the Duke's writing desk sometime during the exchange, gave his Grace one long, unblinking, entirely unsympathetic look, and began, with great deliberation, washing a paw. "Don't," said the Duke, to the cat who was named Plato, and who had opinions about everyone in the household and had just formed a new one, "start." Plato started anyway. Plato had never, in point of fact, stopped. The magistrate's business was concluded by 9:30, on time, to the visible astonishment of the magistrate, who had been coming to Ashcombe Hall for boundary disputes for 11 years, and had never once seen its master arrive to a meeting, with his hair imperfectly arranged, and an expression like a man recalculating something he'd thought settled. The grazing rights were confirmed. 4 tenant families would eat through the winter. None of them would ever know they owed it, in some small oblique fraction, to a fountain, a cat, and a woman who did not yet know the house's rules well enough to be frightened of breaking them. Julian Thorne told himself, dressing in a room brighter than he had allowed it to be in 3 years, that the new housekeeper was impertinent, unschooled in the running of a great house, and would require a firm conversation before the week was out. He did not have the conversation. He told himself this was an oversight. It was not an oversight. It was the first of a great many things, that autumn, that he would tell himself, and then quietly, without ceremony, fail to believe. By the 2nd week of her employment, Cassia Whitlow had opened the curtains in 4 rooms nobody had asked her to touch, corrected an error of £11 4 shillings in a coal merchant's invoice that the previous steward had been paying without question for at least a year, and reduced Mrs. Hale the cook to helpless laughter twice, which the kitchen maid Nell reported to the still-room, with the breathless urgency of a woman relaying a change in the weather. She had not spoken to the Duke again. This was not for lack of opportunity. He manufactured the opportunities himself, with a diligence he would have found suspicious in anyone else. The gate to the kitchen garden required inspecting. The household accounts, previously the exclusive province of a steward named Abbott, who kept them competently, but without imagination, suddenly warranted the Duke's personal review, which necessitated summoning the housekeeper, since a third of the entries concerned linens and coal she alone could speak to. A loose slate on the east wing roof, which had been loose for at least 2 winters without troubling anyone, was discovered to require immediate attention, and immediate attention required, somehow, a full accounting of which rooms beneath it were currently in use. "He's found 4 reasons this week to ask you about the roof," Mrs. Hale observed, kneading bread with the flat, unbothered competence of a woman who had watched a great many things happen in this kitchen, and expected to watch a great many more. "There is nothing wrong with that roof that 4 reasons ought to require. He is a very thorough employer," said Cassia, who was totting figures at the kitchen table and did not look up. "He is," said Pemberton, from the doorway, in the voice of a man who had served the house for 26 years, and permitted himself exactly 1 raised eyebrow a fortnight, and appeared to be spending this fortnight's allotment now. "A man who has not asked a single question about that roof in 2 years, 3 months. And, Nell, when did the slate first come loose?" "Michaelmas before last," said Nell, with the promptness of a woman keeping her own private ledger. 2 years and 1 month, Pemberton corrected himself, and withdrew, satisfied, leaving Cassia to eat her toast with the particular composure of a woman who has decided not to examine a compliment too closely for fear of finding out it was one. She was, in fact, extremely good at the parts of her work that had nothing to do with the Duke. She found, in her 2nd week, that the previous steward's accounts for the home farm had been quietly padded for 18 months by a supplier billing for cartage that had never occurred. And she proved it not by suspicion, but by the tedious, satisfying method her father had taught her, laying the delivery dates against the gatehouse log, which no one had thought to cross-reference in a decade, and presented the discrepancy to Mr. Abbott with such calm, itemised, unimpeachable clarity that the steward, a proud man not accustomed to being corrected by anyone, let alone a housekeeper 4 weeks in post, sat in silence for a full 10 seconds before saying only, "I shall write to the man Thursday," and never questioning her figures again. The Duke heard of it before dinner. He heard of most things before dinner. The servants' hall ran, that autumn, on a rumour network faster and more reliable than the post, and its favourite subject, increasingly, was the new housekeeper. He found her in the estate office that evening, correcting a column by lamplight, and stood in the doorway a moment before she noticed him, which she did almost immediately, because she had stopped, in 4 short weeks, entirely failing to notice when he entered a room. "I hear you caught Grimsby's cartage fraud," he said without preamble, in the manner of a man who had rehearsed several more elegant openings and discarded all of them on the stairs. "I hear you have a very efficient staff for gossip," said Cassia, not looking up from her column. 18 months, Your Grace. £41, near enough. I've written to the man myself, since Mr. Abbott seemed disinclined to enjoy it. You wrote to him yourself. Someone had to enjoy it, she said, and looked up then, and it was there, a full 2.5 by the clock on the mantel, which she would swear afterwards she had not deliberately timed, though she had. that something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. It arrived, was noticed by its owner with what looked like faint alarm, and was retracted with the swift, practised efficiency of a man closing a door he had not meant to leave open. She said nothing about it. She had, by then, already begun keeping her own private ledger, though she would not have called it that, and would have been mortified to learn that Pemberton had begun keeping an almost identical one in the butler's pantry, the two records destined never to be compared, and yet, by pure coincidence, entirely in agreement. The accounts are in good order, he said, which was not what he had come to say, and both of them seemed to know it. They are, she agreed. Was there something else, Your Grace? There had been something else. He could not, standing in a lamplit office with a woman who looked at him the way no one in this house had looked at him in 3 years, directly, without flinching, as though he were simply a man, and not a grief arranged in the shape of one, locate what it had been. The roof, he said finally, with the air of a man grasping a rope thrown rather too late. The east wing slate. Still loose, said Kasia. I had a man up to look at it Tuesday. He says it'll hold till spring. Ah, said the Duke of Ashcombe, and retreated. With what dignity a man can muster while inventing and then immediately losing an excuse in the same sentence, to his own rooms, where Plato the cat was already installed on the counterpane, watching him with the weary patience of a creature who had, this once, seen the whole thing coming. Not a word, said the Duke. Plato said several words, all of them silent, all of them entirely legible, and went back to sleep. It was in the 3rd week of November that Kasia first understood what the house was actually mourning, and she understood it not through gossip, which told her only the bones of the story, a duchess, 3 years dead, a fever that had come on fast in a cold December, but through the geography of the place itself, room by locked room. There was a door on the west corridor, second from the end, that Nell would not clean past without lowering her voice, as though the room itself might overhear and take offence. There was a garden beyond the orangery, visible through glass, but reached by no path anyone kept clear, its beds gone entirely to bramble, that the under-gardener referred to only as the old mistress's roses, and tended not at all. There was a pianoforte in the small drawing-room, shrouded under a dust sheet so precisely fitted it might have been sewn to the instrument's shape, that no one, in 3 years, had so much as lifted the sheet to dust beneath, and there was above the mantel in the long gallery a portrait turned to face the wall, not removed, not stored, simply turned, its gilt frame presenting a blank canvas back to the room, which struck Kasia, the first time she passed it, as somehow more grief-stricken than an empty space would have been. An absence says a thing is gone. A turned portrait says someone could not decide. She did not ask about any of it directly. She had learned, in 11 months of running a vicarage, that grief answered better to patience than to questions, and so she simply went on opening curtains. Hers was, by November, an unofficial daily circuit of the house, room by room, that no one had assigned her, and everyone had quietly stopped commenting on, and left the west corridor door, the rose garden gate, and the turned portrait exactly as she found them, and waited. She told Pemberton one evening, over the household's mending, the shape of her own grief, because he had asked, carefully, sideways, the way a man asks who has spent 26 years learning that direct questions frighten off the honest answers, how she had come to Ashcombe with a laugh that seemed to survive rather a lot. My father died in February, she said, not looking up from the sock she was darning. He was the kindest man I ever knew, and the worst businessman, and I buried him owing money to 3 different tradesmen, who all came to the funeral anyway, which I choose to think was for him, and not the debt. She tied off the thread. I gave myself a week to cry about it. I was very thorough. And then I decided that if I let the world take my father and my laugh both, that was letting it win twice for the price of one loss, and I have never once in my life agreed to a bad bargain when I could help it. Pemberton, who did not often offer his own history, offered a small piece of it that night, that he had come to Ashcombe as a boy of 14 under the old Duke, and had watched 3 generations of Thorns grieve in this house, and that the current one, in his professional opinion, was grieving the hardest not because he had loved the most, but because he had loved the most silently, and had built, out of that silence, an entire household schedule, as though enough punctuality might substitute for a woman who was never coming back at any hour at all. He was late fetching the doctor, Pemberton said, so quietly Cassia nearly missed it over the fire. 3 years passed this December. 20 minutes, perhaps less. The roads were bad. It would not have mattered, the physician said so himself after, more than once, but His Grace has never, to my knowledge, been late for anything since. Cassia said nothing to this for a long moment, and then said only, "That explains rather a lot about the roof," which made Pemberton laugh, a real laugh, brief and surprised out of him, for the first time she had heard, and which she counted, privately, as evidence of something, though she could not yet have said what. The courtship that followed had no name, and required none. It became, over the following fortnight, simply a fact of the house's operation, the way weather is a fact. Cassia's morning circuit of the curtains had somehow, without either of them proposing it, come to end at the estate office door, with a cup of coffee set down at the Duke's elbow, at precisely the hour he was already awake to receive it. The Duke's afternoon inspection of some minor structural concern had somehow come to require Cassia's presence for a length of time that bore no relation to the structural concern in question, and on 3 separate Thursdays. For reasons neither of them examined aloud, they found themselves walking the lower lawn at the same hour, as though the lawn itself had begun keeping the appointment on their behalf. Neither of them called it anything. It simply became true, the way most things worth having become true, not announced, not decided, but arrived at by repetition until the absence of the thing would have been the stranger fact. Rain trapped them in the library on the first Tuesday of December, a hard, sudden storm that turned the drive to a river and made the walk back to the servants' hall, a proposition Cassia judged unwise in her only good boots, and it was there, with the fire built up and the windows running with water and the whole house gone quiet around them, that the Duke of Ashcombe said more. In the space of 1 hour, than he had said to another living person in 3 years. "You've opened every curtain in this house, except 2, he said, without preamble, watching the fire rather than her. The west corridor, and the small drawing-room. I know, she said. You haven't asked why. I haven't needed to. She was mending a hem by the fire's light, unhurried, her needle moving with the same steadiness she brought to a column of figures. A house doesn't lock 2 rooms and turn a portrait to the wall because nothing happened there, Your Grace. It does that because something happened everywhere else, and those 2 rooms are where it still is. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, which would have been, she had already decided, entirely his right. Her name was Eleanor, he said finally. She played that pianoforte badly, extraordinarily badly. She knew it and played it anyway every evening, on the theory that a house ought to have music in it whether or not the music was good. A pause, in which something in his jaw worked once and stilled. She grew roses in a garden nobody else could keep alive, because she overwatered everything, systematically, and it should not have worked, and it did. She died in December, 3 years ago this month, of a fever that came on in 2 days and left in 1, and I was 20 minutes late fetching the doctor, and it would not have mattered. I have been told this by 4 physicians, at length, unprompted, and I have not once believed them. I don't imagine you would, Cassia said, gently, setting the mending down. Grief isn't very interested in what physicians say is true. It has its own accounts, and it keeps them badly, on purpose, the way she played the pianoforte. He looked at her then, really looked, the way she had looked at him the first morning, direct and unguarded, and slightly startled at his own daring, and something crossed his face that was not quite the almost smile from the estate office. It was smaller than that, and stiller, and lasted, by her count, 4 full seconds, and it was, she understood with a small private lurch, the first real one, not performed, not corrected, simply arrived and permitted to stay a moment before he remembered himself. I buried my father owing money he never told me we had, she said, into the quiet that followed, and I have spent every day since deciding not to let that be the last thing I feel about him. It doesn't mean I don't grieve him. It means I refuse to let grief be the only thing left standing when everything else has been asked to leave the room. She met his eyes. You could open those 2 doors, Your Grace. It wouldn't be losing her. It would just be letting the rest of the house catch up to how much you still love her. He did not answer that immediately. But 3 days later, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission, he crossed the west corridor himself, and unlocked the sitting-room door, and stood in the doorway a long while, and did not go in, and did not lock it again either, which everyone in the house understood, without a word being spoken, to be a beginning. Cassia found the pianoforte dust sheet folded, not removed, but folded, set neatly on the bench, a week after that, and said nothing about it to anyone, and counted it, in the private ledger she still would not have called a ledger, as the second entry of the month. Whatever had begun that December might have continued at its own unhurried pace, indefinitely, had the world outside Ashcombe Hall not, as the world reliably does, developed opinions of its own. The first sign was a letter, delivered to the Duke by the evening post in mid-January, bearing a seal Pemberton did not recognise, and a hand the butler privately described to Mrs. Hale, as the penmanship of a man who has practised his own signature more than his sums. It was from a Mr. Silas Grey, a cousin twice removed on the Duke's father's side, presumptive heir to the title, in the continued absence of a direct one, announcing his intention to pay a visit to Ashcombe in a fortnight's time, in a spirit of family concern, the letter specified, twice, as though repetition might make the phrase truer, regarding, it said delicately, certain reports that had reached him of the estate's management under circumstances of prolonged and understandable grief. He means to say, said the Duke, reading it aloud to Cassia in the estate office with the flat, controlled voice of a man declining to be provoked by paper, that he has heard I have not smiled in 3 years, and intends to use it as an argument that I cannot be trusted with a ledger. Can you be trusted with a ledger? I have never once mismanaged this estate. Then he's about to have a very disappointing visit, said Cassia, and meant it, and privately began, that same evening, going back through 18 months of accounts a second time, not because she doubted them, but because she intended, when Mr. Silas Grey arrived, for there to be no question left for him to ask that had not already been answered, in triplicate, before he thought to ask it. The second sign arrived a week later, and was rather harder to file away as merely irritating. The Dowager Duchess, Julian's mother, wrote to announce her own visit, timed, with a precision Cassia suspected was not accidental, to overlap with Mr. Thurter Gray's, and mentioned, in a postscript that occupied nearly as much space as the letter proper, that she had taken the liberty of also inviting Lady Prudence Fenwick, a sensible, well-connected widow of good family and excellent temperament, whom the Dowager had long felt would make a most suitable second Duchess of Ashcombe, when Julian was ready, which she trusted. Given the improvements she had heard reported of the household this winter, he very nearly was. The Duke read this letter twice, and set it down with the particular care of a man setting down something he would rather have thrown into the fire. He said nothing about it to Cassia. This, more than the letter's contents, was what she noticed. He did something else instead, quietly, in the same week, that Cassia would not learn of for a month, and that the household would learn of rather sooner, on account of Nell's brother working at the coaching inn in the village, and hearing it directly from the solicitor's own clerk. The Duke of Ashcombe settled, in full and without comment, a debt of £11 still owed by the estate of one Thomas Whitlow, bookbinder, deceased, to 3 separate tradesmen in the town where Cassia had grown up. Debts she had never mentioned to him, had in fact never mentioned to anyone at Ashcombe at all, and had assumed, with the resigned practicality of a woman used to carrying such things alone, would simply take another 2 years of careful saving to clear. He instructed the solicitor, in writing, that the matter was never to be traced back to him, on pain of the solicitor's finding other employment. The solicitor, being a sensible man, kept the secret exactly as long as it takes a village clerk to mention it to a coachman's sister, which was, in the event, 11 days. Cassia did not yet know. The household did. It kept the secret from her with the guilty, delighted silence of people holding a gift they were not permitted to give, and it was Pemberton, in the end, who could not quite manage it, and told her, gently, over the mending, on the theory that a woman ought to know when the ground beneath her had quietly and permanently changed shape. She did not go to the Duke about it. She sat with it a full day first, the way she had once sat with her father's death, giving herself time to be thorough about a feeling before she let it out into the world. And when she did finally find him, in the estate office, predictably, at an hour that had somehow become theirs without either of them naming it so, she said only, "You paid my father's debts." "The solicitor," said the Duke, with the stiff formality of a man caught at something, was instructed not to say. The solicitor told a clerk, who told a coachman, who told his sister, who works in your kitchen. Said Cassia, "You cannot keep secrets in a house with this many staircases, your Grace. It's practically a design flaw." She was not, he noted, crying, though her voice had gone thinner than usual. "Why?" "Because you have spent 4 months opening curtains in a house that gave you nothing back for it," he said, "and I found I did not care to be the kind of man who let a woman go on carrying a debt like that alone, while I sat in a well-lit room feeling grateful." It was, by a wide margin, the longest unbroken sentence anyone had heard him produce in 3 years, and it seemed to cost him something to finish it, and Cassia understood, watching him say it, that this halting, over-explained, entirely unnecessary justification was as close to a declaration as the man currently knew how to make, and that it would be unkind and untrue to everything he'd just done to pretend she hadn't noticed. "Thank you," she said simply, which was the correct thing to say, and also, she suspected from the look on his face, not remotely the thing he had braced himself to hear. The Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe arrived on a Thursday in a carriage that announced her a full 10 minutes before she did, and swept into the front hall with the particular energy of a woman who had spent 30 years running a great house and had not entirely forgiven anyone else for attempting it since. She was, Cassia would decide within the hour, formidable in the specific way of women who have buried a husband and outlived their own patience for pretense, handsome, upright, dressed with a plainness that was itself a kind of statement, and possessed of a stare that had reduced, by the household's own account, 3 previous housekeepers to tears before luncheon. She did not go to luncheon first. She went to the household ledgers. "Show me the accounts," she said to Cassia, without preamble, in the estate office, having dismissed her son with a wave that brooked no negotiation. "All of them. Not the ones you have prepared to show me, the ones underneath." Cassia sat down, without hesitation, both the fair copy and the working book beneath it, ink-blotted and honestly corrected, exactly as she kept them for no one's eyes but her own, and, occasionally, the Duke's and the Dowager Duchess read for 11 minutes in complete silence, turning pages with the brisk economy of a woman who had once run this exact office herself and had not forgotten how. "You caught the cartage fraud," she said finally, not looking up. "I did. You wrote the coal merchant a letter so sharply reasoned he reduced his rate voluntarily, rather than have you write him a second one." "I did." "And you have," the Dowager Duchess said, closing the ledger and looking up at last with the full weight of her attention, "opened every curtain in this house, except the ones you had the sense to leave for him to open himself." Cassia said nothing to this, because there was, she judged, nothing safe to say. "Sit down," said the Dowager. "I intend to ask you a number of questions, and I should like you to answer them as though I were not a duchess and you were not employed by my son, because I find that arrangement produces the only honest conversations I ever have any more." She asked, over the following half-hour, a great many things, about Cassia's father, her education, her reasons for taking service, her opinion of the estate's tenant arrangements, her opinion, delivered with a directness that made the Dowager's mouth twitch in a manner Cassia would later recognise as the family's suppressed smile, of the Dowager's own suggestion that Lady Prudence Fenwick might suit her son. She would suit him the way a well-made coat suits a man who has stopped feeling the cold, Cassia said, before she could stop herself, and then did not take it back, because she had decided, 4 months ago in a fountain, not to be a woman who took things back out of fear. "He does not need suiting, Your Grace. He needed someone to open the curtains. I don't say that to claim any particular credit. Someone was always going to. Eventually, it simply happened to be me. But I would not stand here and pretend a sensible, suitable match is the same thing as a warm house." The Dowager Duchess was quiet a long moment, in a silence that Cassia found, despite herself, harder to bear than any of the questions. "My son," said the Dowager finally, "did not smile at his own father's funeral, which I confess I understood, nor at his wedding, which I did not, being under the impression a wedding was meant to be a happy occasion even when arranged with sense rather than passion, which his was. He did not smile at Eleanor's funeral either, which no one expected, and he has not, to my own knowledge, smiled since. Until, apparently, sometime this winter, in a library during a rainstorm, which I have heard about from no fewer than 4 separate servants, none of whom I asked." She stood, gathering her gloves with the finality of a woman closing an account. "I came here prepared to find a fortune-hunter, Miss Whitlow, because that is what mothers of dukes are trained to expect, and I have found instead a woman who caught a coal merchant's fraud, and paid it no more mind than she'd give a moth in a cupboard. I withdraw Lady Fenwick's candidacy. She was never going to win it. I merely required to see for myself why not. At the door she paused. "Attention," she said, "is a rarer gift than affection, Miss Whitlow. Anyone can love a duke. Almost no one troubles to see one. You will do." It was, everyone later agreed, the finest thing anyone had ever heard the Dowager Duchess say, and Mrs. Hale wept about it, briefly and without embarrassment, over the washing up. Mr. Silas Grey arrived 2 days later with considerably less grace and considerably more paperwork, and found, to his evident and increasing frustration, an estate whose books were in better order than his own, presented to him by a housekeeper who answered every one of his pointed questions with a specific date, a specific figure, and a specific ledger page. Until his talk of neglect and mismanagement had nowhere left to stand, and he was reduced, by the end of the second day, to complaining instead about matters of form. The housekeeper's presence in meetings that ought by rights to concern only gentlemen, which the Duke of Ashcombe answered with 4 words that Pemberton, who was present, repeated in the servants' hall for a full week afterward with undisguised relish. She corrected your arithmetic. Mr. Grey left on the 3rd morning, his petition unwritten, his visit unmentioned in any letter he sent thereafter, having discovered that a household this thoroughly, transparently well run offered nothing whatsoever for a man hoping to find disorder to exploit, and having discovered, further, that the Dowager Duchess herself had taken the housekeeper's side within a day of arriving, which left him no ally in the house at all, not even, in the end, the cat, who bit him. But the visit, though one, was not without cost. In the course of Mr. Grey's inquiries, the question of Cassia's continued propriety in the household, a housekeeper so evidently, so publicly favoured by her employer, unmarried, unchaperoned in any meaningful sense, had been raised, not maliciously but carelessly, by a cousin looking for any crack to widen, and the Dowager Duchess, for all her new-found approval, had been obliged to agree, in the interest of protecting Cassia's own reputation from a scandal neither of them had asked for. That some distance would be wise, until matters were, her word, settled. Cassia was moved, within the week, to oversee the linen inventory at Ashcombe's smaller dower property 4 miles distant, a task that wanted perhaps 3 days and was assigned transparently for a month. She did not protest it. She understood exactly what it was, and why, and she went, because she had never yet in her life refused a piece of necessary, unglamorous work, and did not intend to start now, merely because her heart objected to the timing. The Duke of Ashcombe, for his part, threw himself into the estate's business with a ferocity the household had not seen since before Eleanor died, inspecting drains, reviewing leases, riding out in weather he would ordinarily have judged imprudent, and Pemberton, watching him work through a second candle past midnight for the 4th night running, remarked to Mrs. Hale that his Grace appeared to be trying to outrun a distance of precisely 4 miles by means of arithmetic, which was, in the butler's professional opinion, not going to work. It did not work. On the 11th day, over a dinner he had not touched, the Duke of Ashcombe set down his fork, looked at Pemberton, and said, "Have the grey mare saddled," in a voice that made the butler, who had, by his own later admission, been waiting 3 weeks for exactly this sentence, nearly smile in front of a footman. A lapse in 26 years of service he did not regret for one instant. It had rained through the afternoon, and turned, by evening, to a cold, thin, persistent sleet, the kind that soaks through wool before a rider has gone half a mile, and it was in exactly this weather, on a road he knew well enough to ride blind, that Julian Thorne, Duke of Ashcombe, covered 4 miles in considerably less time than was sensible, and arrived at the Dower House's kitchen door. Not the front, because the front would have required announcing himself, and he had not yet decided what he was announcing, with his hair plastered flat, his greatcoat streaming, and no earthly excuse prepared, for the first time in 3 years, for why he had come. Cassia opened the door herself, because the Dower House kept a staff of 2, and both were occupied elsewhere, and found on the step a duke who had ridden 4 miles in sleet without a hat, and appeared, for the first time since she had known him, entirely undone by his own arrival. "You're soaked through," she said. "Yes," he said. "You'll take a fever." Possibly she stood back to let him in, and he did not move, which she understood, watching his face, was not indecision, but the opposite. A man who had come this far specifically not to be let off the step so easily, who had in fact 4 miles worth of things to say, and had apparently decided the doorway was where he intended to say them. "I have made a study," he said, "of not being late. For 3 years. I have been early to everything, meetings, dinners, my own grief, which I arrived at so promptly I have never once managed to leave it." He stopped, started again. "You told me I was late the first morning I ever spoke to you, and you were the only person in this house who has been right about my timing in 3 years. Because I was late. I have been late, Cassia, for longer than I let myself understand, for every ordinary, unremarkable happiness a man is meant to have. I did not open the curtains, I did not open the roses, I did not open the pianoforte, or the West Room, or, God knows, myself to anyone, in 3 years, and then a woman fell into my fountain and told me to hurry up for a magistrate, and I have not managed to catch up to my own life since. That's not an apology," she said, though her voice had gone unsteady. "It isn't. I don't have one prepared. I have a list instead." He counted it, badly, on fingers gone stiff with cold, self-interrupting himself twice. "Because you moved the beehives without asking, and they've never produced better honey. Because you told my mother Lady Fenwick suited a man who'd stopped feeling the cold, and I have not stopped feeling anything since October. Because Plato sleeps on your side of the estate office now, and has stopped speaking to me. Because the roses are budding a full month early, and the under-gardener swears it's the pruning, and I know it's you. Because I have not once, in 4 months, managed to finish a sentence to you without wanting to say something larger than the sentence could hold. And I am attempting very badly to say the larger thing now." "Say it properly, then," she said, laughing despite herself, though her eyes had gone bright. "You've never once been late for anything that mattered to you. Don't start with this. Marry me," he said. "I am doing this appallingly." "In the sleet, on a doorstep, without a ring, which is at the jeweller's in the village, being sized, which I ordered a fortnight ago, entirely presumptuously, before I had asked you anything at all. You ordered a ring before you asked me. I have been reliably informed," he said, "that I am late for everything. I did not intend to be late for this as well." Cassia Whitlow stood in a doorway in the sleet and laughed, not the composed, dry laugh she gave the world, not the deflecting laugh that kept a room at arm's length, but the other one, the full, involuntary, surprised out of her kind she had not released completely in longer than she'd admit. And it went on, by no one's count but her own, for a length of time that felt, to both of them, considerably longer than it was, and when it finished she was still smiling. and she said, "Yes, obviously, yes," in a voice with no performance left in it at all. And he crossed the last of the distance between them and kissed her, once, briefly, entirely without elegance, on a doorstep, in sleet, in front of no one but a startled scullery maid who would tell the story for the rest of her working life. "You're freezing," Cassia said, into the collar of his ruined coat. "I am aware," said the Duke of Ashcombe, not moving. "You ought to come in." "Presently," he said, and did not, for a while yet, because he had spent 3 years being early for everything except this, and found, having finally arrived, that he was in no hurry at all to leave. The negotiations that followed the engagement were, by the Dowager Duchess's own later account, the shortest and least sentimental she had ever witnessed, on account of both parties treating the largest decision of their lives with the same brisk, itemised clarity Cassia brought to a coal merchant's invoice. "The roses come with me," Cassia informed him, 3 days after the engagement, over breakfast. The first breakfast either of them had eaten on time in living memory. "That garden is mine to keep, and I intend to overwater it exactly the way she did, on the theory that it worked once, and I see no reason to improve on a method that succeeded." "Agreed," said the Duke, "provided the pianoforte stays uncovered. Badly played, if necessary. I find I have missed bad music rather more than I expected to. I don't play. Neither did she, in any way that could be called playing. I don't believe that was ever the point." "Then I shall learn to play it very badly indeed," said Cassia as a tribute, and the Duke of Ashcombe laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind the household had not heard from him in 3 years, and had begun, privately, to wonder if they ever would again, and Pemberton, passing the breakfast-room door with a tray he did not strictly need to be carrying at that hour, stopped in the corridor, listened for the 4 full seconds it lasted, and permitted himself at last. The eyebrow he had been rationing all winter. The wedding itself was small, quick, and conducted with a briskness that scandalised precisely no one who had met either party. It took place in the village church on a grey morning in late January, attended by the household in its entirety, by 4 tenant families whose grazing rights a certain magistrate's visit had once secured, by the Dowager Duchess in a hat that drew more comment than the bride's dress, and by Plato the cat, who had not been invited, had never in his life required an invitation, and installed himself with magnificent indifference upon the altar step throughout the ceremony, from which position he was removed twice by an increasingly harassed verger, and returned, on both occasions, by the bride herself, who declared, in a whisper the front 3 pews all heard, and none repeated without embellishment, that he had personally approved the match in October, and had therefore earned his seat. The Dowager Duchess wept, openly, unapologetically, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had brought for precisely this purpose, and had denied, right up until the vows themselves, any intention of needing, and told Mrs. Hale afterward, over the wedding breakfast, that she had cried harder at this wedding than at her own, which she considered on reflection entirely appropriate, since her own had been arranged with excellent sense, and this one had been arranged with nothing but the 2 people actually getting married, which she had come, in her considerable age, to think was probably the better method after all. Cassia Thorne, Duchess of Ashcombe, spent her wedding night not at a ball, which neither of them had wanted, but walking the length of the house with her husband, room by room, opening, for the sheer ceremony of it, since every curtain in the place was by now opened daily as a matter of course. The 2 doors that had taken the longest, the small drawing-room, where the pianoforte sat uncovered and slightly out of tune, and the west corridor sitting-room, where they stood a long moment in silence before the Duke said, simply, she would have liked you enormously, and found you thoroughly exhausting, which Cassia understood, correctly, to be the finest compliment either woman in that room was ever likely to receive from him. Spring came to Ashcombe early that year, or seemed to, though the gardeners privately credited nothing more mystical than an unusually mild February, and a new mistress who overwatered everything on principle. By April the rose garden beyond the orangery had been cleared of 3 years' bramble, and stood in its second flush of blooming, tended now by a duchess who was, by her own cheerful admission, no better a gardener than her predecessor had been, and succeeded, somehow, exactly as often. The pianoforte in the small drawing-room was played most evenings badly by a woman who had taken it up as a private joke, and found, to her own surprise, that she had grown fond of the noise it made regardless of her skill, and the household had long since stopped flinching at the sound, and begun, instead, to leave the drawing-room door ajar, so it might carry down the corridor. The portrait in the long gallery had been turned back to face the room in March, at the new Duchess's own suggestion, and hung now beside a second, newer canvas, a wedding portrait, unremarkable in composition, remarkable only for the fact that in it, for the first time in the gallery's long and largely solemn history, the Duke of Ashcombe was depicted with his mouth unmistakably, undeniably curved upward, an expression the painter had been obliged to sketch 4 separate times before capturing it correctly, on the grounds, he told Pemberton privately, that he had simply never had occasion to paint that particular family's smile before, and had needed the practice. The smile itself, once so scarce it had wanted counting, had become by summer a matter the household no longer tracked with any precision, which was, everyone silently agreed, the surest sign of its recovery. He smiled most mornings now, over coffee brought to the estate office at an hour that had become, without ceremony, simply the hour coffee arrived. He smiled, on occasion, before breakfast, which Mrs. Hale considered the single most reliable indicator of a happy household she had encountered in 30 years of service, and which she noted, with satisfaction, in a ledger of her own that she had also never have called a ledger, and had also never once stopped keeping. The curtains, every one of them, in every room of Ashcombe Hall, opened before 8 each morning as a matter of unremarkable routine, including, by high summer, the ones in a small east-facing room on the nursery floor that did not yet have any particular need of morning light, but would, the household was given to understand with a discretion that fooled absolutely no one, have need of it before the following winter was out. Mr. Silas Grey was not seen at Ashcombe again. He wrote once in the spring a letter of congratulation so stiffly worded it read more like a legal filing than a felicitation, and received in reply a note from the new Duchess thanking him warmly for his concern for the estate's management, and enclosing, with what he could only assume was deliberate cruelty, a copy of that quarter's impeccably balanced accounts. No one at Ashcombe ever discussed him again with any particular animation. He had wanted more than anything to matter to the outcome, and had not, which he would have minded a great deal more than anything else, had anyone troubled to tell him so. Plato the cat, having concluded his supervisory duties to his own evident satisfaction, retired that summer to a permanent post on the window-sill of the small drawing-room, where he could observe both the badly played pianoforte and the roses through the same pane of glass, and was widely regarded by the household, with something approaching reverence, as the true architect of the entire arrangement, a theory, he did nothing whatsoever to discourage. The Dowager Duchess visited twice that summer, uninvited both times, on the stated grounds of inspecting her grandchild's prospects, of which there were not yet any, and departed both times having found nothing whatsoever to correct, which she found, on reflection, the single most restful outcome of any visit to Ashcombe in a decade. As for the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe themselves, they kept that first bloom season of their marriage no schedule at all beyond the one the house had quietly written for itself. Curtains at 8, coffee shortly after, badly played music some evenings, roses overwatered on principle, and a household that had learned, room by patient room, that a house need not choose between honouring what it has lost and opening itself to what it has been given. There are houses that stay sealed forever, mistaking their locked rooms for loyalty. Ashcombe was not, in the end, one of them, and its master, once so punctual in everything except his own happiness, was heard to remark to his wife, one ordinary morning in June, that he had spent 3 years terrified of ever again being late for something that mattered, and had discovered, entirely by accident, in a fountain, in October, that the only thing worth hurrying for had simply walked in and opened the curtains herself.